Hello and welcome. I know I haven't posted a video in quite some time. I've had some major life events happen. I have gotten a job. I am completing my final semester at university, and I will be continuing on to university next semester for graduate school. The footage you're about to see of this dress was actually filmed last year around this time. Every year for my birthday, I like to make myself an evening dress, and last year I decided to make a 1950s cocktail dress. I was inspired by a lot of pictures I was seeing on Pinterest of these 1950s dresses and their multi-layers of tulle and different colors and all of that fun, beautiful stuff. This video didn't get posted last year because I wasn't able to actually get pictures of the dress until relatively recently. With that being said, I hope you enjoy. The first piece of this dress to tackle was the base skirt layer, which I made from this lovely either rayon or cotton Faille. I used an 8-gore circle skirt pattern that I self-drafted, and I also cut out a pocket at this time as well, one pocket for either side of the skirt. The only changes I made was adding a 1/2 inch to the side seam allowance, which makes the side seam allowance 1 inch in total, which makes it much easier to alter this dress in the future if need be. I cut all those pieces out and then serged them to finish. I have my front piece here, my side front, side back, and back piece. This dress will close down the center back. The next step was to attach the pockets as well as cut out and attach the hem facing. Here is a closer up view on the pocket. You see the pocket is ironed toward the front. That's because that's how your hand gets into the pocket. And you don't want you putting things into or taking things out of the pocket to disrupt the lines of the dress. It's hanging from this little twill tape that I'm pointing at because that will help distribute the weight of the pocket onto the waist seam that is more structurally sound than the skirt side seam. Here is the hem facing. My hem facing I drafted to be 4 inches wide, and I have 3-inch wide horsehair braid, which is stitched on at the bottom here, and the top portion of the horsehair braid that has that that adjustable thread is also sewn by machine, but first I folded over this top layer of the hem facing, and that'll be stitched by machine, and then this whole thing will be stitched by machine to the skirt, right sides together, flipped over, and then the top will be sewn down by hand. Here's how it looks sewn by machine. As I said, right sides together, and then it's going to be flipped under and sewn by hand. At this time, the center back seam has not been sewn. That's because this whole process is so much easier when the skirt is laid flat. Here is a closer up view on the skirt hem facing from the top as well as from the underside. You can see it was just whip stitched in place there. The center back seam was also sewn at this time with a 9 inches or so on the top left open to insert the zipper later on. Now I did lose the footage of cutting out the tulle layers that you'll see in the next clip, and so I'll insert a diagram of the different layers that makes up the tulle outer portion of the skirt. And so the tulle layers are 2 widths of the full width of the fabric. So one 108 width on the front and one on the back. The 2 seams there will be matching up to the side seams of the skirt. The bottom layer is a deep blue color, I think called Periwinkle on Mood. The second layer is a lilac, and then the top layer is a lighter blue color. You'll see in the next clips that I was still debating when I was constructing the dress whether to have a layer of light blue silk organza to put between the tulle layer and the base layer. I eventually decided to go with it for reasons that I will discuss momentarily. Here is the tulle layers. You see I have attached them with safety pins to the skirt. That is because it's much easier to use safety pins than traditional pins with heads or straight pins, because that just keeps getting caught, and this tulle is so densely gathered, it's much easier to attach it more firmly with a safety pin. And so you see the 3 layers that I discussed earlier, all attached at this time. And I gather them down by machine, making sure to match side seam with the side seam of the skirt. And also I left 9 inches or so on the tulle layers. I just did a dash at the center back because that is where the zipper will be inserted, and so I don't want to have any of the tulle interfere with the zipper. Here is how it all looked once it was stitched together. The tulle layers have been stitched together, not to the skirt, but to each other, because I was still debating whether to have the silk organza layer. As you can see, the ivory is poking through a lot, and I want that color to be much more diffused and more blue. So I will go and add the silk organza layer in between the tulle and the ivory base layer. Also, I am going to iron that tulle layer, or more properly steam it, and so it deflates a little bit and is a little bit more A-line and less cupcakey. Here is the silk organza layer. The silk organza layer was 29 inches long and then 4 full widths of the fabric, because the fabric was only 45 inches wide. And so I also left a gap for the zipper at the center back, and I sewed them with French seams and then finished the bottom here with a lovely rolled hem. Here is the silk organza layer pleated to the base layer and basted in place. I decided to pleat this layer instead of gathering it to minimize the bulk on the skirt waistline area. So as I mentioned, the silk organza layer is 4 widths, full widths of the fabric. And so there is a center front seam, a center back seam, and then 2 side seams, which will be matched up to the side seams of the skirt itself. I did cut a little gap in the side seams of the silk organza layer and did a dash as well in the tulle layers so I can still access the skirt's pocket. I will insert a little video of me doing so hopefully that visual will give you a little better explanation. And then here you can see the tulle layer that has been sewed together and pressed, so that lies a little flatter, and the next step was to do the same to the silk organza layer here, steam that down, and then attach them together. Here is my bodice pieces that I self-drafted. I have a front piece with a center front seam, a side piece, and then a back piece as well. And I'm cutting it out of the ivory base layer. And there's also as you see, a 1-inch seam allowance on the side seam for more easy alterability in the future. Here are my bodice pieces all serged together and waiting to be sewn. The center front seam will be sewn and the princess seam there, but not the side seam, because I am going to drape the tulle layers separately on the front and back pieces, again to make this more easy to alter in the future in case that needs to happen. So it's kind of a theater style of doing the front and back trimmings, etc. separately, and leaving that side seam much more easy to access and let out if need be. There will be a break in the pleating there, but that really doesn't bother me that much. I'd much rather have the alterability access to it. I didn't really have any plan. I just wanted to kind of match the vibe of some of the inspiration photos that I was seeing. And so here is the back, which is much more simple because it is essentially a rectangle. And so I just pinned on some pieces until it looked nice. And essentially I just gathered, or more properly pleated actually. I pleated them up, and then I also basted them or tacked them in place at the side seam, as well as the little princess seam here at the back, and then the center back. I used this invisible thread as well to make the stitches that will be permanent. And this is essentially a thin fishing line, and so it's barely noticeable, if at all. And then here is the front of the bodice. And at this point, I was unsure whether I wanted the one side to completely drape over or just drape over at the bust. But I essentially did the same thing as I did to the bodice in the back and just draping until it looks nice. Here is the bodice all draped and tacked down. So I tacked down the front at the side seam, the princess seam, as well as the front seam. And here you can see I also attached them permanently together, the front and back parts of the bodice. I decided to do just the crisscross drape on the bust instead of taking it all the way over to the front side seam. And the next steps were to iron those side seams open and as well as bind the top of the bodice. Here is the bodice all bound. That binding was just sewn in place using some whip stitches. And then I also have that bias tape laid out there, as you see, to attach to all of the seams of the bodice, the side seam, the back princess seam, the front princess seam, and the center back seam. And I'm going to bone these seams using a 6mm synthetic whalebone. Here is the boning channels and boning all in place. As you see, the boning started 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the bodice because that is where the skirt will attach together. The next step is to make some bust pads to help fill in that area and provide some comfort and support. I'm making them out of 3 layers of cotton batting and then covering them in the same base layer fabric. Here is my pattern for my bodice, and I'm just kind of demonstrating the shape of the bust cup. Essentially, if you're making like a bustier dress and that cup piece, as I'm outlining with my finger, that is the shape of my bust padding. Here is how it looked. I cut those 3 layers of cotton quilt batting, and then I decreased them going in so as to make that shape more gradual and a little more dimensional. And as you see, I am demonstrating that the thickest part is actually going to be on the inside and facing the outside of the bodice there. Here you see them covered. I did some machine pad stitching and then machine binding as well. And these bust pads were just tacked in place to the top and bottom of the princess seam there. Now that the interior structure is all done, it's time to attach it to the skirt. Here is me attaching the giant skirt to the bodice. As you see, it is a very thick boy underneath my presser foot, but my sewing machine did a nice job of managing all of that layers of fabric. The next step was to install the zipper. That's also the final step of this dress. Here you see the zipper installed. I did the zipper installation by hand, and so the silk organza layer and the ivory layer is attached to the zipper, but that cut I mentioned earlier I made in the tulle layer, that is not attached to the zipper in any way. So the tulle folds over the zipper and hides that. Also making sure the tulle doesn't get caught and torn. Now, I know I said the zipper was the final step. However, once I put the bodice on, I saw that the side seam was a little bit itchy because of that tulle in contact with my skin. And so I put a lining in. Lining's just made out of regular old cotton. And then I whip stitched all of that in place. And I also did a couple other things since I first made this dress. That big old seam allowance you see at the waist, I actually folded towards the skirt and kind of whip stitched it to the base layer. I also added a waist stay, not to the entire bodice, but just to the back, just a little bit of Petersham ribbon and a hook and eye at the waist to help remove stress from the zipper at that area and just make getting into the dress easier. And I also added a hook and eye at the top of the dress. And with those little additions, the dress is complete.